Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Library. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time it is as you press play, we're honored to keep you company as you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the stillness around you, and the space you've made to simply let go. If you enjoy this experience, we invite you to subscribe to the Sleep Library. We create gentle, slow, and calming stories to help you sleep. Stories you won't hear anywhere else. And in the comments below, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Your words help us build a global, restful little community. One quiet listener at a time. Now, if you're ready, let's travel back to a time not often remembered. Under the pale silver mist of early morning, the marshlands lay quiet, their still waters reflecting the faint light of the rising sun. Somewhere far off, a curlew called, its cry stretching thin across the flat, empty expanse. The air smelled, faintly of mud and damp reeds, carrying that soft mineral scent only noticeable when the world is just waking. Into this silence stepped a lone figure, barefoot, the water lapping gently around their ankles. This was the life of the leech collector, a profession as quiet and uncelebrated as the marsh itself. The work began before most villagers had taken their first bite of bread. The task was simple in theory: gather enough medicinal leeches to sell to physicians, barbers, and apothecaries, but in practice it was cold, slow, and often painful. Collectors were usually among society's poorest. A farmer's widow, too old to work the fields, but still able to wade through shallow waters, might take up the trade. A boy from a fishing family, light and nimble enough to slip through the reeds without startling the creatures, might do it too. Some families passed the work down through generations, treating it as a seasonal harvest, just like hay or grain. The method was primitive but effective. The collector would stand in the shallows with bare legs and weight. Drawn by warmth and the faint vibrations of movement, the leeches would find them and attach themselves. Slowly they would wriggle into place, fastening their tiny mouths to skin. Sometimes a collector emerged from the water, with a dozen or more clinging stubbornly to them. They would pluck each one off carefully, taking care not to tear the soft, slippery bodies and drop them into a clay jar or wooden pail lined with damp moss. The small wounds bled freely, but a seasoned collector thought nothing of it. Leeches were valuable because medieval medicine saw illness through the lens of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Good health meant balance, and disease meant one humor had overwhelmed the others. Bloodletting, the deliberate removal of blood, was believed to restore that balance. It was prescribed for fever, headaches, inflammation, even melancholy. While a knife or brass fleam could be used, leeches offered a slower, supposedly safer method. They would feed only until full, then drop away, which seemed gentler than opening a vein and risking too much loss. In the minds of medieval healers, they even purified the blood, drawing out what was bad. Once enough leeches were gathered, the collector carried them to market. If the marsh lay close to the village, they might walk straight to the apothecary's door. In more remote areas, they would travel miles to reach a market town. The leeches had to be kept alive in damp cloth or moss, or in small wooden barrels, drilled with breathing holes. They could not dry out, or they would die and be worthless. Prices rose during times of sickness or war, when demand was high, and fell during healthy seasons. Many collectors also sold other marsh goods, rushes for floor coverings, reeds for baskets, herbs for medicine, to make ends meet. Some of these leeches ended up in the dim, low-ceilinged rooms of barber surgeons. The air in such places was thick with the scent of herbs, vinegar, and the metallic tang of blood. Shelves held jars, some filled with cloudy liquid in which dark shapes writhed. Barber surgeons cut hair, pulled teeth, set bones, and performed bloodletting. For certain patients, they reached for a leech. One might be placed on a patient's temple to ease a headache, or on their arm to treat a fever. The leech would latch on, feed for half an hour or more, and drop off when satisfied, leaving only a small bleeding mark to be bandaged. The collector's trade was not without risk. Marshes hid snakes, biting insects, and sudden sinkholes that could swallow a leg. The wounds left by leeches sometimes became infected, and in regions where collecting was heavy, the leech population could be stripped bare. By the 19th century, some areas had laws to protect against overharvesting, but in the medieval period, no such restrictions existed. Collectors took as many as they could carry. Leeches even crept into superstition. A jar kept in the home was believed by some to draw illness out of the air. Others read omens in the bite marks they left behind, as if the patterns foretold the course of an illness. In a few grim cases, leeches were swallowed to treat internal ailments, an act as unpleasant as it sounds, and rarely ending well, for the patient. By midday, the imagined collector's pail would be heavy with moss and the gliding shapes of a morning's work. Their legs would be dotted with small bleeding bites, their clothes damp from the water. Back in the village, the leeches would pass into the strange, unscientific world of medieval medicine, becoming part of the daily work of healers. And when the next dawn came, before the mist had lifted, the collector would step once more into the quiet marsh, ready for another day of the slow biting ritual. The city slept under a heavy darkness, the kind that settled deep into every alley and courtyard, muffling sound and dimming even the moonlight. Somewhere in the tangle of narrow streets, a man moved quietly with a lantern in one hand and a long-handled shovel in the other. His boots scuffed the cobbles, the faint light catching the damp sheen of the stones. The hour was late by design. This was work no one wanted to see, much less smell. He was a gong farmer, a night soil man, one of the unseen laborers who kept the medieval city from drowning in its own filth. By day, the streets belonged to merchants, apprentices, and housewives with baskets. By night, they belonged to men like him. The term gong came from an old word for dung, and the work was exactly what it sounded like, climbing down into cesspits and privies, to remove the waste that had collected there. In cities without proper sewage systems, every house and inn had its pit, and when the pit was full, someone had to empty it. This was not a job for the faint of heart. Cesspits were often narrow, built of stone or timber, and dug deep to keep the smell from rising too strongly into the rooms above. Yet smell was inevitable, especially in summer, and even in the still air of winter. The stench could make a newcomer gag within moments. A gong farmer would arrive with a lantern, ropes, buckets, and his long-handled shovel. Sometimes, if the pit was particularly deep or dangerous, he would lower himself in on a rope, working by the wavering light while his helpers stayed above to haul up the buckets. The waste, known politely as night soil, was carted away in barrels to the edge of the city, often to be sold as fertilizer to farmers in the surrounding countryside. It was a strange economy. What was unbearable in the city became valuable in the fields. The pay for such work was better than many. Expected, though still meager by the standards of clean trades. Because few people could stomach the job, a gong farmer might earn a little more than a laborer in the markets or on the docks. Still, the social cost was high. The smell clung to skin and clothing, no matter how much one washed. People crossed the street to avoid you, and in some cities, gong farmers were required to live on the outskirts so that their presence would not offend the wealthier quarters. Yet the work was essential. Without them, the narrow, crowded streets would become breeding grounds for disease far worse than the odors that already lingered in the air in winter. The pits were cold and sluggish, the contents heavy and slow to move. In summer they were alive with flies, and the heat made the stench rise like a living thing. Lanterns had to be handled carefully. The buildup of gases in a long-neglected pit could catch fire if exposed to a flame. There were stories half cautionary tale, half grim humor of careless workers whose lanterns sparked an explosion, sending both waste and worker flying. Such accidents were rare but never forgotten in the telling. For all the filth, there was a rhythm to the work. The streets were quiet, the only sounds the scrape of shovel against stone, the splash of the bucket as it was lowered or raised, the muted clop of the cart horse waiting in the shadows. The air might be still, heavy with the scent of refuse, but above the rooftops the stars were sharp and bright. A gong farmer learned to work steadily, without rushing, conserving his strength for the long night ahead. There was no glory in it, but there was a kind of rough pride knowing that when morning came, the city would wake to cleaner streets because of his unseen labor. Children sometimes watched from windows as the men passed, their small lanterns bobbing in the dark. They whispered to each other about the strange trade, wrinkling their noses, imagining the horrors of the pits. Yet in time, some of those same boys would take up the shovel themselves, whether by necessity, inheritance, or simply the lack of other work. It was not a trade one boasted of, but it was honest, and it paid enough to keep bread on the table. For men who had no land, no apprenticeship, and no patron to open other doors, it was one of the few steady incomes available. When, The night's work was done. The gong farmer and his helper would guide their cart out through the city gates. Beyond the walls, in the dim half-light before dawn, they would make their way to the fields. Farmers waited there with coin or goods to trade, eager for the rich fertilizer that would feed their crops. The waste that had been despised in the city became in the countryside something almost welcome. By the time the sun rose, the men would be making their way home, their work unseen by the city that depended on them. The streets would be busy again, filled with traders, bakers, and children playing in the same alleys that only hours before had echoed with the quiet scrape of a shovel dot. It was a strange life, half hidden in shadow, half tied to the needs of everyone around you. The gong farmer knew he would never be celebrated, never thanked, and rarely even looked in the eye. Yet without him, the city's grand halls and bustling markets would have stood atop streets unfit for human life. In that quiet, unspoken way, his work was as important as any king's decree or merchant's bargain. And so, night after night, lantern in hand, he would walk the narrow lanes toward another pit, ready to vanish into the dark and do the work no one else would. The streets before dawn were still and heavy with the damp chill of night, the air holding that faint scent of coal smoke and wet stone. Most windows were dark, shutters closed tight against the lingering cold, but here and there a pale candlelight flickered inside, showing the shadow of someone moving about before the day began. Out in this quiet walked the knocker-up, a long pole in hand, moving from house to house with a steady, practiced gait. His job was simple to describe and strangely vital to the rhythm of a city before alarm clocks were common. He was paid to wake people for work. Factories, mills, and docks demanded laborers at precise hours, often well before sunrise. If a man overslept, he risked losing his day's wages or his job entirely. And so there were those who made a living ensuring others did not miss the start of their shift. The knocker-up carried a long stick, sometimes tipped with wire or a soft knob, to tap on the upper windows where his clients slept. For those who lived in higher buildings, a pea shooter was sometimes used instead, sending a harmless but sharp rap of dried peas against the glass. In the stillness of early morning, these small sounds carried well, a gentle percussion echoing between the narrow streets. The knocker-up moved quickly, but not hurriedly, keeping to a route that had been agreed upon with his customers. Some worked in the dense industrial towns of England, where whole rows of houses belonged to mill workers. Others served quieter villages where only a few needed waking at odd hours. Payment was often made weekly, in coins or in kind bread, tea, or whatever small luxuries the customer could spare. There was a rhythm to this work, a strange intimacy between the knocker-up and the sleeping households. He knew which doors creaked when opened, which windows stuck in the frame, which sleepers needed 3 taps instead of 1. Some clients trusted him so fully they would not even stir until his signal came, no matter how light the morning or how noisy the street. It was not unusual for a knocker-up to wake entire families at once. The father for the factory, the mother for her work as a washerwoman, the older children for apprenticeships. For households without clocks, he was as essential as the water pump or the baker's cart. The work demanded an odd relationship with time. While others went to bed in the evening, the knocker-up often stayed awake through the night, resting. Only in the hours after his morning rounds. His sense of the day was inverted, his busiest hours those when the rest of the city still lay wrapped in sleep. In winter this meant walking through fog or falling snow, his breath hanging in the air, lantern swinging in his free hand. In summer, it meant hearing the first birds long before the streets stirred, the pale light of dawn spreading slowly behind the rooftops. Sometimes there were interruptions, a drunken reveler staggering home and trying to strike up a conversation, a stray dog shadowing him down the lane, or the rare but memorable moment when someone forgot to cancel the service before leaving town, resulting in several days of fruitless knocking. The job required patience, a strong sense of duty, and the ability to keep moving through the coldest mornings without complaint. For all its simplicity, knocker-ups formed an important part of industrial life. Without them, the precise schedules of factories and trains might falter. In the age before cheap alarm clocks, a single overslept shift could cost a worker dearly. The knocker-up was a bridge between the world of personal responsibility and the strict demands of the industrial clock, ensuring that even the heaviest sleepers met their obligations. As the years passed, and mechanical alarm clocks became affordable, the trade began to fade. By the early 20th century, the knocker-up was more curiosity than necessity, remembered fondly in some neighborhoods and mocked in others as a relic of slower times. Yet for those who once relied on the sound of tapping on the window at 4:30, the memory was tied to the rhythm of their working lives. It was a job born of need, carried out in the quiet hours when the world felt suspended. And while it left no grand monuments or famous names, it kept countless people from losing their place in the world of work. And as the knocker-up finished, his last tap of the morning, the streets still dim and cool, he would turn for home, satisfied that another day's labor had begun for those who counted on his knock to stir them from dreams. The church bells had long since tolled for the dead, their slow, heavy sound carrying over the hills and through the narrow lanes of the village. Inside one of the small stone cottages at the edge of the settlement, candles burned low, their flickering light softening the shadows against the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax, stale bread, and the faint tang of smoke from the hearth. Gathered around the still form of the departed, the family kept their quiet vigil, speaking in hushed tones or not at all. They waited for a man who was not kin, not clergy, but someone whose presence was as much a part of the ritual as the prayers themselves. He was the sin-eater, a figure both needed and shunned, whose task was to take upon himself the spiritual burdens of the dead, so that the soul might pass, unencumbered, into the next life. The practice was simple in its outward form and strange in its meaning. On a wooden plate near the body lay a piece of bread, sometimes with a pinch of salt or a sip of ale beside it. The sin-eater would enter the room without ceremony, often without greeting, and take his place near the head of the deceased. While the family watched, he would eat the bread and drink the ale, consuming, in the belief of the ritual, the sins of the one who had passed. It was a quiet act, but one filled with deep unease. The bread, once blessed for the dead, was thought to absorb their moral stains, their unconfessed wrongs, their lingering debts to heaven. By swallowing it, the sin-eater symbolically took those burdens upon himself, freeing the departed to rest in peace. To the families, the sin-eater was both a helper and a shadow. His service offered comfort, the reassurance that nothing left unresolved in life would weigh down the soul in death. Yet outside of these moments he was avoided. People crossed the street to keep from meeting his eyes, whispered about him behind doors, and discouraged their children from speaking to him. To be a sin-eater was to carry the spiritual refuse of others, a role that left a man permanently tainted in the eyes of his neighbors. Payment was meager often, only the bread and ale themselves, perhaps a few coins if the family could spare them. For the poor it was still a living, if a lonely one. The origins of the practice were murky, rooted in folk belief more than church doctrine. The church officially frowned upon it, seeing it as a superstitious intrusion into matters of the soul that belonged only to the clergy. Yet in remote villages far from the reach of strict ecclesiastical oversight, the custom persisted. Death was not only a spiritual event, but a communal one, and in these small communities, people clung to every tradition that might help the dead find peace and the living find closure. The sin-eater became a fixture, his services called upon. In the quiet hours after death and before burial, when grief was still sharp and the air in the room felt thick with things left unsaid, beyond the sin-eater, other figures moved in the world of mourning. Women skilled in preparing the dead, washing and clothing them, arranging the hands, and sometimes placing coins upon the eyes. Neighbors who came to sit through the night in what was called the wake, sharing quiet conversation to keep death from feeling too close. In some places, professional mourners were hired to weep and keen, their voices rising and falling in long, drawn-out cries that seemed to stitch the living and the dead together for a moment before the final parting. Each roll, whether loud and public or silent and solitary, formed part of the tapestry of death rites that gave shape to loss. The sin-eater's own life was rarely long or happy. Taking on the sins of others was believed to weigh on the spirit, to darken a man's own prospects for salvation. Whether he believed this himself or not, the effect was the same. He was a man apart, living at the margins. Children sometimes followed him at a distance, daring each other to get close, only to run off squealing when he turned his head. Adults spoke to him only when necessary. His cottage, if he had one, was likely isolated, perhaps near the edge of the churchyard or down a lane seldom used. And yet, when death came, it was his presence they sought, his silent meal they trusted to wipe clean what could not be confessed in time. On this night, the sign-eater finishes the bread slowly, washes it down with the ale, and wipes his mouth. With the back of his hand, he glances once at the still face of the deceased, then turns and leaves without a word. Outside, the air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth from the churchyard. Behind him, the family begins to murmur again, their vigil changed by the knowledge that the ritual is complete. They will bury their loved one in the morning, and they will believe, whether fully or half in doubt, that the soul now goes lighter into the hereafter. The sin-eater walks back into the darkness, his steps steady on the worn path, already carrying more than just his own share of the world's weight. In the days when cobblestones still rang with the soft clip-clop of hooves, and the lamplighter's pole was the last thin silhouette against a dimming sky, there existed a profession so quietly unglamorous that it rarely made its way into ballads, or books, yet so vital that without it, entire towns might have succumbed to hunger, disease, and chaos. The rat-catcher, moving in the shadows between market stalls and cellar doors, was both feared and needed. A figure who understood the secret passageways of the unwanted creatures that shared human spaces. If you close your eyes and let the years fall away, you might picture them in faded coats, smelling faintly of oils and herbs, their boots soft with the dust of back alleys, and their eyes sharp in a way that came from watching for small movements in the corner of a room. Long before pest control became a matter of sleek vans and discreet phone calls, the problem of vermin was a constant companion to anyone who kept food, grain, or warm shelter. Rats and mice were not merely nuisances. They were formidable survivors, capable of gnawing through wood, climbing rough stone walls, and producing litters so quickly that even the most determined efforts seemed to slow them only for a time. In medieval towns, where open drains might run alongside narrow streets, and rubbish piles became feeding grounds, rats found everything they needed: warmth, shelter, and endless scraps from kitchens and markets. The rat-catcher's work was a mixture of patient observation and sudden bursts of movement, for rats are clever and quick, testing their environment with whiskers and darting away at the first sign of trouble. Some worked with small dogs, wiry and fast, bred for centuries to flush and dispatch rodents in tight spaces. Terriers in particular became the rat-catcher's companions, their sharp teeth and boundless energy turning the grim work into something almost like sport. Others relied on ferrets, those sinuous little creatures that could slip into burrows and chase out their quarry, sending rats fleeing into waiting traps. The traps themselves were sometimes simple: wooden boxes with a spring loaded, door baited with a bit of grain or cheese, and sometimes elaborate, designed to hold multiple animals alive for collection. There were, after all, uses for a captured rat beyond its immediate removal. In certain cities, Rat catchers earned extra coins by selling them for rat baiting contests, a cruel form of entertainment where dogs were pitted against a number of rodents in a small pit, the outcome measured in speed and efficiency. In the quieter lanes and byres, though, the work was less about spectacle and more about quiet necessity. Grain stores were sacred places in an age when a failed harvest could mean famine. Rats gnawed into sacks, leaving behind droppings that spoiled the food, and their mere presence was enough to spread illness. Most infamously, the fleas they carried could transmit plague. During outbreaks, the rat catcher's role became even more crucial, though it was also dangerous. To handle rats in such times was to dance with invisible death. Yet still they went about their work, for there was coin to be earned and a strange sort of pride in doing what few others would dare. In some regions, rat catchers became minor local characters. Their knowledge of alleyways, stables, and the habits of vermin making them almost like unofficial map keepers of the underbelly of their towns. They knew which bakers were careless with their flour sacks, which innkeepers let scraps fall behind the kitchen bends, and which warehouses harbored nests in the rafters. Sometimes they were called discreetly through a back door, paid in coin, that was pressed quickly into their palms so no one else would see. The work had an air of secrecy about it, as though to admit one needed a rat catcher was to confess to some private failing. Tools and tricks varied widely. In some cases, poisons were used, though these were dangerous and often unreliable. Early, poisons might be mixtures of crushed glass, lye, or certain herbs thought to sicken the rodents, but such methods risked harming cats, dogs, or even children who might come into contact with them. More often, rat catchers preferred to rely on their animals, traps, and a deep understanding of rodent behavior. They knew that rats followed habitual paths, running close to walls, avoiding open spaces. They studied droppings, gnaw marks, and greasy smears along the baseboards where fur had brushed repeatedly. This was a kind of forensics before the term existed, a reading of signs that told the story of unseen lives. Rat catchers were also, in a way, part-time storytellers themselves, passing on tales of monstrous rats the size of cats of cunning, animals that evaded traps for weeks, and of strange encounters in the dead of night when only the rustle of tiny claws on wood betrayed the intruder. Whether all such tales were true hardly mattered. They became part of the folklore of the trade. In some towns, the rat catcher might be summoned not only for rats, but for other pests, stoats in the chicken coop, weasels in the storehouse, even the occasional snake that had wandered into the warmth of a bakery. This made them versatile. Problem solvers, though their reputation remained forever tied to the image of the rat. Payment could be per rat caught, by the job, or by a kind of retainer fee, especially from larger estates that wanted to ensure their granaries remained untouched. Wealthier households sometimes employed their own in-house pest controllers, but in the cramped quarters of city life it was the independent rat catcher who roamed freely between neighborhoods. In literature and song, rat catchers rarely appeared as heroes. If they were mentioned at all, it was often as shadowy figures, perhaps a little grimy, moving in the margins of the story. Yet their role in keeping communities livable was undeniable. Without them, the damage to food stores, the spread of disease, and the sheer discomfort of constant infestation would have made city life far harsher. The rhythm of their days might start at dawn, when rats were returning to their nests after a night's foraging, or in the still hours of the afternoon, when the streets were quieter and sudden movements were easier to spot. Sometimes their work took them into the sewers, where darkness and the stench of waste made every step treacherous. Here they might move by lantern light, following the squeaks and the shifting shadows, setting traps in places where the current of the water slowed enough for debris to gather. For where debris gathered, food scraps often followed, and where food was, the rats would not be far behind. The life of a rat catcher could be lonely, but it had its own small rewards. A good day's work meant a lighter larder for the vermin and a few more coins in the pocket. Some took quiet satisfaction in knowing they had protected a family's winter grain, saved a baker's flour, or spared a child from the sickness that followed in the wake of unchecked pests. Others simply saw it as a way to earn a living in a world where honest work was not always easy to come by. The tools of their trade, traps, nets, sacks, and sometimes little cages for their animals, were worn smooth with use, smelling faintly of earth, wood, and the musk of their quarry. Over time, these objects became extensions of the catcher's own body, as familiar in their weight and balance as a blacksmith's hammer or a fisherman's net. And when the day's work was done, the rat catcher might be seen walking home. In the twilight, a small dog trotting at his heels, the last light catching on the curve of a wire trap slung over his shoulder. In the quiet between footsteps, one could almost forget the scurrying world he had just left behind, the hidden struggle between man and creature that played out daily beneath the surface of city life. Yet tomorrow it would begin again, as it always had for as long as people and rats had shared the same narrow streets. There is something quietly hypnotic about the sound of a river moving at its own unhurried pace, lapping against stone and timber as though time itself has loosened its grip and chosen to drift. Imagine, if you will, an early morning long before, the world of steel bridges and concrete embankments, when the river was a living, breathing spine through the heart of a city, carrying not just goods and boats, but also stories. The air is cool and damp, a faint mist clinging to the surface, and along the muddy banks a few lone figures pick their way carefully over the slippery ground. They bend low, eyes scanning the sludge, hands probing beneath the thin skin of water, seeking whatever the currents have surrendered overnight. These are the mudlarks, a breed of workers so intimately tied to the rhythm of the river that their fortunes rose and fell with each turn of the tide. The mudlark's life was not one of glamour, but of persistence and quiet familiarity with the overlooked. They searched not for treasures in the sense of gold coins and gleaming jewels, though on rare occasions fortune smiled that way, but for the practical and the possible. Lumps of coal dropped from barges, iron nails that could be straightened and sold, fragments of rope, pieces of timber, the occasional bottle or broken piece of pottery that might find a second life in some humble kitchen. In London, particularly along the Thames during the 18th and 19th centuries, mudlarking became both a necessity and a peculiar craft. Children, often barefoot and thin as the poles they carried, would trudge into the muck with baskets slung over their shoulders, their eyes sharper than any merchant's for the small glint of something useful. They knew the river's moods, where the silt built up into little pockets that caught heavier objects, where the currents slackened enough to allow debris to rest, and where the smell of the bank hinted at something freshly washed ashore. The work began as the tide receded, for only then could the hidden floor of the river be revealed. Time was short, only a few hours before the water returned, and so they moved quickly but carefully, always with one eye on the river's slow, inevitable creep back up the shore. The smell was a constant companion, a mix of brine, damp wood, and the less pleasant tang of refuse and decay, for rivers in those days carried everything, the runoff from workshops, the waste from homes, the unmentionable products of a crowded city without modern sewers. Yet to the mudlarks this was not filth so much as opportunity, for the river's discards were their harvest. And it was not just London. In many port cities across the centuries, similar figures haunted the shorelines, scavenging from the water's edge. In medieval towns, river scavengers collected driftwood fires, shells for lime burning, even the occasional drowned cargo from an unlucky barge. Some were officially employed by the local lord or the city guild to recover lost goods, in which case they had to account for their finds. Others operated unofficially, selling their spoils quietly in the markets. In some fishing villages, the scavengers were known for finding pieces of sailcloth or rope torn free during storms, patching them into new nets or selling them to boatmen. In the colder months, a mudlark's fingers would ache from the chill of the water, and frost might rim the edges of their baskets. Yet there was a rhythm to it that some grew to love, the quiet solitude of the bank in the early hours, the ripple of the current like a low voice in the background, the small joy of spotting a promising glint beneath a thin film of water. For some, the river even became a sort of friend, a partner in the strange dance of give and take. The finds were not always pleasant. Mudlarks might uncover the skeletal remains of animals swept downstream, or fragments of clothing still clinging to some sad, heavy shape. In those moments the work carried a weight beyond the purely physical. Yet life continued, and the river, indifferent to tragedy or triumph, kept on moving. Markets in the poorer quarters often had stalls or corners where the goods of the river were sold. A blackened lump of coal could mean warmth for a night. A bent but serviceable nail might be straightened over a small fire and used to repair a fence or a crate. Even shards of pottery were bought by rag-and-bone men who crushed them into grit for other uses. The value was not in the beauty of the object, but in its potential. Children were particularly suited to the work because of their lightness and agility. They could scramble down slippery slopes and balance on narrow beams left from old piers, reach into holes and crevices where heavier adults could not. Some worked in small family groups, handing baskets from one to the other as they filled, while others worked alone, fiercely guarding their favorite spots along the river. In the evenings, the day's catch would be sorted and cleaned, sometimes by the dim light of a tallow candle, and the more valuable pieces kept aside for sale to scrap dealers. In many ways, the mudlarks were a hidden part of the city's recycling system before such a term existed, quietly returning objects to circulation that would otherwise have been lost to the current. Their presence also formed part of the city's invisible geography, those liminal spaces between land and water, rich with the detritus of daily life. To walk the river's edge at low tide was to walk through a record of the city's private life, each fragment a quiet witness to something, once whole and now discarded. There is something soothing in imagining their slow, methodical search, the gentle squelch of mud underfoot, the patient scanning of the ground, the occasional pause to lift an object, turn it in the light, decide whether it belonged in the basket, or tossed back into the river. In these unhurried movements, the noise of the world seemed far away, replaced by the whisper of water and the call of distant gulls. Over centuries, the river gave and the mudlarks took, and in this quiet exchange, there was a kind of balance. It is tempting to romanticize them now, but their lives were often harsh and uncertain, dependent on the whims of the tide and the fickleness of what the current chose to release. Still, in the endless patience of their work, in the way they made something from nothing, there is a lesson in attentiveness and persistence, one that drifts as gently as the river itself through the memory of time. Then let us drift quietly into the lamplit haze of another age, when cities were not stitched together by the endless hum of electricity, but rather by pockets of warm, flickering light tended by human hands. It was a time when the night was not banished completely, but coaxed into gentleness, when every evening brought with it a slow transformation of the streets. As the sun sank and the shadows grew long, figures in dark coats and sturdy boots emerged from side streets and alleyways, carrying with them their curious tools, long poles tipped with small flames or later, with hooks and latches to adjust, the gas valves that would feed each lamp. These were the lamplighters, quiet custodians of the city's nights, men and sometimes women whose work was as much ritual as it was profession. In the earliest days of public street lighting, the task was even more intimate. Before the invention of gaslight, lanterns hung from hooks along the street had to be kindled one by one. Some cities used oil lamps with their reservoirs filled each afternoon and their wicks trimmed with patient precision so they would burn clean and steady through the long hours. A lamplighter would begin his route before the sky was fully dark, the pale light of dusk still clinging to the rooftops, and moved steadily from post to post. The glow of his small flame would be the only spark until each lamp caught and bloomed into life, sending a fragile halo into the cooling air. There was a rhythm to it, a pace born not of hurry but of constancy. In winter, when the nights drew in early, the lamplighters started their rounds before many shopkeepers had closed their doors. In summer, their work began later, sometimes, under skies streaked with the last deep blush of sunset. But regardless of the season, the lamps had to be lit, and so the lamplighter became a fixture of the neighborhood, a figure seen but rarely spoken to, moving like a shadow touched by fire. When gaslight arrived in the early 19th century, it changed the city's night in ways that were both subtle and profound. No longer did lamplighters carry open flames to kindle wicks. Instead, they wielded long brass poles with levers that opened and closed the valves feeding gas to the mantles. A small pilot flame, protected within the lamp's glass, would catch and flare into brightness as the valve was opened. The lamplighter would pause just long enough to make sure the flame was steady, then move on to the next, the hiss of gas, and the bloom of light, repeating in a hypnotic pattern. The work was not without its hazards. Gas lines could leak, lamps could shatter, and in icy weather the iron posts became slick and treacherous. Yet for many lamplighters, the job was a source of quiet pride. They were, in their way, keepers of safety. A well-lit street was less likely to harbor thieves, and travelers could find their way without stumbling over the uneven stones or sinking into the gutters. In some towns, lamplighters were given keys to the gates or locks that secured the city. After dark, for they were among the last to finish their rounds, and the first to stir again before dawn. For their duties did not end with lighting the lamps. At daybreak, the same figures returned to extinguish each flame, either snuffing it directly or closing the gas valve with a deft twist of the wrist. The morning rounds were different, quieter, even more solitary. The streets were often empty save for the sound of a milk cart or the distant calls of vendors setting up their stalls. The lamplighter would retrace his route in reverse, leaving behind a street bathed once more in the pale, directionless light of day. In some places, lamplighters carried ladders, for not every lamp was mounted at a height reachable by pole. The ladders, heavy and awkward, had to be balanced carefully against the posts. Climbing them on frosty mornings when the air stung the fingers and the breath rose in clouds was a test of both balance and endurance. And yet there was a certain intimacy in those moments, the lamplighter alone in the high silence, the city still half asleep below. Children often watched for them in the evenings, peering from windows as the familiar figure made his way along the street. There was something almost magical about the sight. One by one, the darkened shapes along the road sprang to life with a warm, living glow. Some children imagined the lamplighter as a kind of conjurer, able to summon light. From nothing, stories grew around them. that they carried a spark stolen from the sun, or that they whispered to the flames to wake them from their daytime sleep. In truth, the magic lay in the regularity of the work, and the comfort of knowing that no matter the weather or the season, the lamps would be lit, and the darkness would soften. The tools of the trade were simple, but well kept. A lamplighter's coat had deep pockets for spare wicks or small tools, and many wore gloves with the fingertips, cut away so they could better manage their equipment. Some carried a small oil can to keep hinges and valves moving smoothly, for a stiff mechanism could mean a lamp left dark. Their poles were often personalized, a familiar weight in the hand, worn smooth by years of use. In places where the streets were long and the lamps many, lamp-lighters were assigned to specific districts. They came to know every turn of the road, every uneven cobblestone, every overhanging tree branch that needed to be brushed aside. They knew which lamps had a tendency to sputter, which valves were stiff in the cold, and which globes needed polishing more often. In this way they became silent archivists of the streets, noticing changes others might miss, a shutter left open, a missing sign, a new face lingering too long in the shadows. Even as technology advanced, the lamplighter endured. In some cities, electricity began to replace gaslight, and the lamps could be switched on from a central station. But for decades, the old system persisted alongside the new, and the lamplighter continued to make his rounds. There was something reassuring about the presence of a human figure tending to the light, long after they were no longer strictly necessary. Some towns kept their lamplighters as a tradition, a living link to a gentler rhythm of life. For the lamplighters themselves, the job could be lonely but meditative. The slow walk through darkened streets, the pause at each lamp, the satisfaction of seeing the road transformed behind them. These were small, steady pleasures. Many spoke of developing a kind of companionship with the lamps themselves, as though each post had its own personality. Some lamps stood proud and tall, others leaned slightly, as though tired from holding up the light year after year. The glass might be clear and bright in one, clouded and streaked in another. And in the stillness of the early hours, when the city slept and only the lamplighter and the lamps kept watch, there was a peace that few other trades could offer. Winter nights brought their own challenges. Snow piled against the posts, and the lamplighter's boots left solitary tracks in the fresh drifts. The light from the lamps was softer in the snow, casting halos that shimmered as flakes drifted through the air. Fog could make the work eerie, the lamps appearing as pale orbs in the mist, each one a small beacon in an endless gray sea. In heavy rain, the lamplighter's coat would grow heavy and sodden, the hood pulled low to keep water from dripping into his eyes. But still the rounds were made, for the city depended on its lights. And in the warmer months, when evenings stretched long and the lamps were not lit until the last colors of sunset faded, the work took on a different beauty. The air was scented with flowers and dust, and the city hummed with the sounds of laughter spilling from open windows. The lamplighter moved through it all quietly, a presence neither fully noticed nor forgotten. Over time, the figure of the lamplighter took root in the cultural imagination. They appeared in poems and paintings, in songs and novels, often as symbols of constancy or quiet care. They were there at the threshold between day and night, the hinge on which the city turned from one state to another. And though their role has all but vanished in the modern world, the image of a solitary figure walking the lamplit streets endures, a reminder of a slower, softer time when light was not taken for granted, and the simple act of tending it could be both a duty and a gift. The first sound is not the bell, though it often begins there. It is the clearing of a throat somewhere just beyond the edge of a market square. It is the slight shuffle of boots on uneven stones, a murmur from someone who already suspects what is about to be announced. Then, at last, the note, bright and metallic, spilling into the morning air like a drop of sunlight catching on glass. The town crier stands there, posture straight despite the early hour, his voice rising in a tone meant not for one listener, but for all, for the baker dusting flour from his hands, for the washerwoman bending over the cold stream, for the child with a half-chewed crust of bread in his mouth. This was a world before headlines could be inked by the thousands, before telegraph lines hummed with the breathless urgency of distant events. Words had to travel on human legs and be shaped by a human mouth, and so the crier was not merely a messenger, but the very thread that bound a town to the world beyond its gates. He did not speak hurriedly, for his task was not to race against the clock, but to carry the shape of each syllable into the furthest reaches of the street. The cobblestones themselves seemed to remember the timbre of his voice, the way it would ring against the stone facades of the houses and dissolve into the faint clinking of a far-off forge. His announcements were many things at once: the proclamations of kings, the taxes to be levied, the lost items to be claimed, the punishments to be observed, the rare joys to be shared. In some towns he would be given a particular corner where people would gather when they heard his bell, and there he would stand, a figure at once ordinary and essential, wearing the town's colors, perhaps a feathered hat or a broad-brimmed one, against the rain. Sometimes in winter the bell would feel like a cruel instrument in his frozen hands, but still he would ring it, because the town depended on him, and in that dependence lay his own quiet pride, as the days passed into seasons, and the years into decades. The crier became something more than his role. He was a kind of witness not only to events, but to the changing faces of the people, to the slow weathering of the stone steps, to the way ivy crept further along the sides of the old inn. He knew whose child had grown tall enough to carry the family's goods to market alone, whose husband had returned from the wars with a limp and a distant stare, whose shop now sold different wares because tastes had shifted. These were not the things he cried aloud, for they were not part of his official duty, but they became part of his inner archive, the collection of moments he would carry home at the end of the day, Long after the last bell had been rung, there was, in the way of all things, a rhythm to the life of a crier. Doan might see him receiving his orders in the grander towns from the mayor or steward, in smaller places perhaps from the parish clerk, then setting out to make his rounds. He might pass through alleys where laundry swayed overhead, where the smell of cooking porridge clung to the damp air, where dogs lay curled in doorways watching him with sleepy eyes. He would find himself repeating the same words at several points in the day, not because the people were forgetful, but because news needed time to settle into the fabric of the place. There were those who could not leave their work to stand and listen when he first came by, so he would call again later, his voice a constant in their week, a sound as familiar as the tolling of the church bell. In some towns the crier also became the informal keeper of lost and found, a dropped glove, a runaway goose, a stray child spotted near the market. He would describe these in the same measured tone, trusting that word would reach the right ears. If the weather turned harsh, as it so often did in the months when days were short and evenings came creeping by mid-afternoon, the crier's task grew heavier. Rain could swallow a voice before it reached the next street, and wind could carry it away entirely. But even then he persisted, perhaps stepping closer to the doorways, cupping his hands around his mouth to project into the heart of a home. People grew to admire this steadfastness, not the showy bravery of a soldier, but the quiet endurance of someone who knows that their work will never be written into the grand histories, yet matters all the same. And when the frost came, biting at his fingers and ears, he would still walk, knowing that somewhere ahead someone was waiting for the news he carried. The evening rounds were different in mood from the morning ones. By then the day's busyness had worn itself thin. Shop shutters were being lowered, the last carts were rattling out of the square, and smoke was curling from chimneys in a dozen shades of gray and white. The crier's voice in such moments felt softer, not because he lacked the strength, but because the air itself seemed to ask for gentleness. Announcements might be of events to come, a fair next week, a traveling troupe performing a play, the arrival of a shipment of goods from a far port. There was a strange intimacy to these twilight messages, as though the town and its crier shared a secret just before night fell. For in truth, the crier belonged to the streets as much as to the people. He learned the way the echoes behaved on damp days versus dry ones, how a particular corner could carry his words around a bend, how the narrowest alleys could amplify his bell until it sounded like something far grander than it was. He became a student of the town's moods, adjusting his pace and tone as though speaking not just to ears, but to the stones, the doors, the air itself. And when he returned home, often to modest lodgings, a single room warmed by a small fire, he carried the day's work with him, sometimes jotting a note or two if he was literate, sometimes simply holding the memory in silence before sleep claimed him in villages where literacy was rare. The crier's importance could not be overstated. He was the bridge between those who made the decisions and those who lived by them. The living voice that transformed ink and wax into understanding. People trusted his accuracy, for he had no reason to alter the message. And when mischief tempted him, it was rarely more than the subtle coloring of a phrase, a hint of warmth in the telling of good news, a careful gravity in the telling of bad. The news of births and deaths often passed through his lips, making him a participant in the cycle of joy and mourning that shaped community life. In a sense, his bell tolled for beginnings and endings alike, even now, in cities where no crier has walked for centuries. There remains something of their rhythm in the public spaces we share, in the way a voice calls over the hum of a market, in the sudden pause when everyone turns toward a single source of sound. It is a faint echo of a time when news was a human presence, not a printed page or a glowing screen, and when the shape of a word could be felt as much as heard. The crier's world was one of patient repetition, of messages carried on breath, and memory of streets stitched together by the sound of a single voice traveling through them. And though the bell no longer rings in the square, the idea of it lingers, gentle as a story told at the edge of sleep, where one sentence drifts into the next, and the quiet continuity of the telling matters as much as the tale itself. In the deep heart of winter, when the rivers lay still beneath their glassy shrouds, and the world's edges softened into silence, there was once a quiet trade that moved to the rhythm of the cold, long before the hum of electric refrigeration or the push of a modern freezer door. People in towns and villages waited for the freeze, not only as a season, but as an opportunity, for winter was not merely endured, it was harvested. And so came the ice harvesters, men bundled in layers of wool and leather, faces red and wind-chapped, carrying saws with teeth longer than a man's hand. They were not in search of fish or gold, but of the frozen bounty itself, clear blocks of river ice pulled up from nature's vault to be stored for the long, warm months ahead. Imagine the quiet first steps of their day before dawn, when the lamps were still burning in kitchen windows and the frost clung to the hinges of barn doors. They would set out on foot or by a horse-drawn sled, the sound of iron runners rasping against the packed snow toward the water they had watched for weeks. Ice strong enough to bear the weight of men and horses was not a certainty, and they knew the signs, the deep blue-gray color, the muffled thump beneath a boot, the way the cold wind sliced without mercy across an unbroken sheet. A chosen spot would be away from the shallows, where reeds swayed under the surface, and far from any place the current might weaken the freeze. The first blows of the ice saw were like the breaking of a spell. Each tooth sank in with a hiss, spraying up tiny shards that glittered in the dim light. They worked in lines, cutting long rectangles, each block measured by sight and by habit, for they had learned what size could be lifted by two men without cracking or slipping back into the dark water. The sound was steady, saw, pull, saw. Pull, a rhythm that seemed to warm them in the frigid air. Around them the winter lay hushed, except for the groan of the ice under strain, and the distant caw of a crow tracing the river's edge. Sometimes the first block would take the longest to free, and once it came loose, the others would follow more easily, sliding against the open water with a smoothness that always felt like relief. The men would hook them with iron tongs, gripping the slick surfaces, heaving them up onto the ice itself. From there, a sled waited, layered with straw, to prevent the blocks from freezing together too soon. As each block was placed, steam would rise faintly from the gap between ice and straw, a ghost of warmth meeting the sharp air. The work was not hurried. The cold made haste dangerous. Fingers stiffened, tools became brittle, and ice itself could fracture if handled without care. Yet they moved with purpose, for the river's gift could not be taken for granted. A sudden thaw could spoil the harvest, and a season's work might vanish in a single warm wind. When the sled was full, the horse would lean into its harness, breath billowing like smoke, and begin the slow journey to the ice house, a low, sturdy building half buried in the earth. Its walls were thick, lined with sawdust or hay, its floor layered in insulation. Inside, the blocks would be stacked in neat columns, each separated by a cushioning of sawdust to keep them from fusing. The air inside an ice house was always still, carrying a faint scent of wood and earth, and the occasional drip of meltwater would echo softly from the corners. In the height of summer, these blocks would be priceless, chipped away to cool milk, butter, or meat, or to make the rare luxury of chilled drinks. But in winter, the value was measured differently. It was in the knowledge that these quiet mornings, these hours of labor under pale skies, would hold the heat of July at bay months from now. There was something meditative in the work, too, a closeness to the season that others might miss. Ice harvesters did not simply watch winter from the safety of a window. They stepped into its heart, learned its language, and pulled from it something tangible. As the day went on, the light would shift to a muted gold, casting long shadows across the frozen surface. The ice itself would change underfoot, creaking more sharply as the temperature rose. By then, the men's shoulders would ache, and their gloves would be stiff with frost. They would pause to eat bread that had gone cold in their pockets, washing it down with tea still faintly warm in its tin flask. Around them, the cut sections of river would refreeze overnight, sealing away the places where they had worked. There was no thought of waste. Every block they could manage was precious. In some villages, the harvest was a communal event, and neighbors would come to watch or lend a hand. Children would run along the banks, stamping their boots to keep, warm, their laughter carrying far in the cold air. Older men might stand aside, leaning on canes, offering advice or stories of winters long gone, when the ice came earlier or the river froze so solid that a wagon could cross without fear. At night, after the tools were cleaned and stored, and the horses fed, the harvesters would gather in the tavern or kitchen, cheeks still flushed from the wind. They would talk in low voices about how much ice had been stored, whether it would last until autumn, and how the freeze compared to the years before. Outside, the stars would burn sharply in the black sky, and the river, patched now with the wounds of the day's work, would gleam faintly under the moon. The life of an ice harvester was not a life of great wealth, but it was one of quiet satisfaction. They worked in partnership with the season, knowing its dangers and its gifts, and their labor bridged the gap between winter's abundance and summer's need. Today, the trade is gone, replaced by machines that hum unseen in kitchens and factories, but the memory remains in old photographs. Men standing on frozen rivers, bundled to the eyes, their breath caught midder as they hoist gleaming blocks toward a waiting sled. There is a certain beauty in the thought of it, the stillness of the river before the cut, the crisp sound of the saw, the cold so deep it seemed to hold time itself. In remembering them, one remembers a winter not as an inconvenience, but as a season of work, of gathering, of keeping for the future. The harvest was never only about ice. It was about the art of patience, the trust in the turning of the year, and the quiet pride in being ready when the sun returned. The workshop smelled faintly of oil and brass, of the warm dust that settled in the folds of velvet-lined boxes and in the grooves of old workbenches. It was the scent of patience, of hours measured not by the sun outside, but by the tiny increments of time marked on a watchmaker's bench. In the dim light, a man sat bent over his work, the curve of his back almost mirroring the bowed dome of the magnifying lens fixed over one eye. His fingers, deft but unhurried, moved across a scatter of gears no larger than seeds, pinching one with tweezers, lifting it and letting it fall into the waiting embrace of a half-assembled mechanism. Somewhere beyond the window, a bell tolled. The quarter hour, but in here, time was counted differently, not in minutes, but in moments. The old clockmakers would tell you that time was not a straight path, but a circle, an endless return. You could see it in the turning of the wheels they made, in the way one tooth pushed another, and another, until the motion came full circle and began again. These men and women who shaped the keeping of hours lived in a world apart from the rush of streets. They were custodians of stillness, caretakers of a thing invisible yet always felt. In towns of centuries past, before the hum of electricity and the blinking of digital screens, time was something you went to find in the shadow of a tower, beneath the brass hands of a public clock, or in the pocket of someone who had paid dearly for its possession. The making of clocks was a craft of quiet devotion. In the Middle Ages, a clock might take months or even years to build, each part filed by hand, each gear shaped from metal that had been poured, cooled, and cut with a precision born only of repetition. The earliest clocks were great hulking things set into the towers of churches and town halls, their workings hidden behind stone and wood, their faces large enough to be read from the marketplace below. They were wound with heavy weights, chains, and counterweights descending slowly as the hours passed. And each day someone, often a boy, sometimes the town sexton, would climb the narrow stairs to wind it anew. Imagine such a boy lantern, swinging in his hand, breath frosting in the winter air, stepping carefully on worn stone steps that spiraled up and up. Above him the great mechanism loomed, a forest of beams and wheels, rods and bells, each part joined to the next in a dance as old as the town itself. He would fit the crank to its place, lean his shoulder into the turning, and feel the clock come to life beneath his touch. The tick, tick, tick of its heartbeat would echo in the wooden chamber, a reminder that in this town at least time was held in place by human hands. As centuries passed, the clockmaker's art moved from the public square to the private room. Tower clocks still stood, but in homes and on mantelpieces, smaller timekeepers appeared. Lantern clocks, bracket clocks, long cases with their pendulums swinging slowly behind glass. These too were built in small workshops, where the only sounds were the scrape of file on brass and the murmured counting of beats as a pendulum was tested. A good clockmaker knew his materials as a farmer knows his land. Brass was soft enough to shape, yet strong enough to hold. Steel for springs had to be tempered just so, and each tooth of each gear had to be cut at the right angle, or the motion would falter. They learned to polish pivots until they shone like drops of water to balance hands so delicately that they neither lagged nor leapt, but glided with the smooth certainty of the sun across the sky. Under the soft hush of a winter evening, when the last shreds of daylight had bled away into a violet haze, and the lamps along the narrow street began to glow like small captured suns, the sound of time itself seemed to hum in the air. It was not the modern rush of digital pulses, nor the quick, impatient tick of plastic clocks. It was a slower, older rhythm, one born of brass gears and coiled springs, of pendulums that swayed like the measured breathing of a sleeping giant. In the heart of this town, where stone buildings leaned together as if to share warmth, there was a shop with a crooked wooden sign swinging gently above its door. Faded gold letters spelled the name of a man who had long since gone to dust, yet the name remained, just as the clocks inside remained, ticking and chiming in their own patient languages. Inside, the air was touched with the faint metallic scent of brass shavings and the whisper of oil that kept ancient mechanisms alive. Shelves bowed under the weight of clocks in every size, from towering grandfather clocks that seemed like sentinels of centuries, to tiny travel timepieces that could slip into a pocket, each one a small captured universe of minutes and hours. The walls were crowded with their faces, each dial a pale moon marked with numbers like constellations, and every few seconds a tiny hand would twitch forward, pulling the world imperceptibly onward. In the center of the room, bent over a workbench worn smooth by decades of careful hands, the clockmaker worked with the calm concentration of one who had devoted his life to a single purpose. His fingers stained with the faint green of brass. Dust moved with a delicacy that seemed almost ceremonial, as though each gear and spring was a relic deserving reverence. Outside, snow began to fall in thin, hesitant flakes, dusting the cobblestones with a fragile white veil, but inside, the clockmaker's world was warm and self-contained. defined not by the seasons, but by the steady beat of time's mechanical heart. Sometimes, as he adjusted a pendulum or polished a gear until it caught the lamplight like liquid gold, he thought about the first clockmakers who had worked in centuries before him, in workshops lit by tallow candles, the air thick with the smell of molten metal. They had crafted tower clocks whose bells rang out over marketplaces, marking the hours for towns where most people could not yet read, where time was something felt in the turning of the sun and the changing of the light. He imagined their tools, heavy and simple, the rasp of files shaping raw metal into teeth that would fit perfectly with their companions, the low murmur of apprentices learning the patience of their trade. There was a kind of holiness in it, to shape time into a thing you could hear and see, to take something invisible and give it weight and form. The clockmaker had once traveled to an old cathedral in another country where the great astronomical clock still turned as it had for 500 years. He remembered standing before it in the dim nave, watching the sun and moon circle on their painted disk, the hands sweeping past zodiac signs like ships drifting past islands, the faint click of ancient gears hidden behind a carved wooden face. Tourists murmured around him, but he barely heard them. All his attention was on the mechanism, on the thought of the man, or perhaps the small team of men who had built it centuries before, perhaps never knowing it would still be breathing its slow mechanical breath long after they themselves were gone. Back in his own shop, he sometimes found himself holding a piece of a clock, a gear no larger than a coin, or a winding key polished by years of turning, and thinking about the hands that had touched it before his. There was a chain of touch, from maker to owner to restorer, each leaving an invisible imprint, like the passing of time itself. Outside, the snow thickened, muting the world into a gentle silence, the kind that made every sound inside seem louder. The faint tick of dozens of clocks at once, overlapping in a delicate, complex harmony, the scrape of a file against brass, the sigh of the bellows feeding the small flame of his soldering lamp. It occurred to him, as it often did in such moments, that his life was measured differently from other people's. Most counted their days in sunrises and meals, in work shifts and weekends. He counted his in the restoration of a clock, the slow, bringing back of a chime that had been silent for decades, the precise alignment of a pendulum so it would swing with perfect symmetry. Time for him was not a rushing river, but a deep, still pond, each moment a ripple expanding outward in concentric rings. Once a woman had brought him a clock that had belonged to her grandmother, a small, ornate mantel clock with curling brass hands and a face of ivory enamel. It had been silent for 40 years, and she had assumed it was beyond saving. He had opened its case, brushing away dust that had lain undisturbed for decades, and found that its heart was still intact, only sleeping. For weeks he coaxed it back to life, cleaning each gear, adjusting the balance wheel until it spun true, polishing the case until it gleamed. When he returned it to her and she heard its first soft chime in nearly half a century, she had tears in her eyes. In that moment he realized that a clock was not merely a machine. It was a vessel for memory, holding within its ticking a link to the people who had once listened to it. There were clocks in his shop whose makers' names had been forgotten, whose owners were long gone, yet they still marked the hours, each tick a heartbeat from another age. He sometimes imagined them as tiny time travelers, carrying their original moments forward through the years, still faithfully doing their work in a world that had changed around them. The night deepened outside, the snow now a soft, steady curtain, and the lamps in the shop glowed like amber in the gathering dark. The clockmaker paused in his work, leaning back to listen. All the clocks were speaking at once, some in quick, light steps, others in slow, resonant beats. Yet together they formed a strange kind of music, the music of persistence, of countless small moving parts, refusing to stop. In that sound he felt the weight of all the hours that had ever passed, and all the hours still to come. He thought about the attic of his childhood home, where an old, broken clock had sat under a sheet for years, its hands frozen at 11:15. He remembered the smell of dust and wood, the slant of sunlight through the tiny window, the way he had stared at that clock as though it might suddenly move again. Perhaps that was when he had decided, without knowing it, that he would spend his life listening for the moments when time seemed to falter, and gently setting it back into motion. Now, as the snow whispered against the window and the clocks went on with their endless conversation, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Outside, the world slept under its blanket of white, but in here, time never slept. It only breathed, steady and sure, carrying the past forward one heartbeat at a time. The village clock had always been there, or so it seemed to those who passed beneath its shadow. Perched high on the stone tower, it looked down over cobbled streets and market stalls, its hands turning with a patient certainty that made the passing years feel less like a rushing river and more like a slow, steady tide. In winter, when frost clung to the eaves and chimney smoke curled thick in the still air, the clock's chime would ring out like a warm voice calling across the rooftops. In summer, the sound seemed to float, mingling with bird song in the distant of bees, a reminder that time was not to be hurried. Yet few gave thought to the hands that kept the clock alive, to the people who knew its gears and springs as one might know the face of an old friend. This is their story, one that begins not in the tower itself, but in a workshop far below, where the scent of oil, brass, and wood filled the air, and the only sound was the slow, measured tick of a smaller clock sitting upon the bench. It was here, in the dim light of an oil lamp, that the clockmaker bent over his work. His hands were steady despite the chill in the air, his eyes fixed on a gear so small it might have been mistaken for a coin dropped by a careless child. Around him, the room was cluttered with tools, tiny screwdrivers, delicate files, brushes for dusting away shavings of metal. There were boxes of springs wound tight as sleeping snakes, jars of pins, and wooden drawers filled with pieces whose purposes only he could name. Outside, the day slipped by unnoticed. the pale winter sun moving across the frosted window, shadows lengthening until the lamplight became the only glow. The clockmaker was not young, but his movements had the quiet confidence of long practice. He knew how to listen for the subtle rhythms of a mechanism, how to feel the tension in a spring, how to judge whether a balance wheel was content or in need of coaxing. He was one of the few who could tend the great clock in the tower, climbing its narrow steps each month to wind it, clean it, and make sure the chimes struck true. Yet the village did not see him often, for his work kept him in this small room where hours could vanish into the patient dance of gears and teeth. The history of his craft stretched back further than most remembered. Long before pocket watches gleamed in waistcoat pockets, there had been great clocks built into monasteries and castles, their heavy weights pulling the days forward. In those times, a clock was not just a convenience, but a marvel, its turning hands a sign that the community was in step with the world beyond its walls. Monks would mark their prayers by the ringing of the hours. Farmers would know when to return from the fields. The earliest clockmakers were as much artisans as they were mathematicians, shaping each gear by hand, their calculations guided by a deep, almost poetic understanding of how time could be divided and measured. In a way, the clockmaker in the village was a descendant of that lineage, his work an unbroken thread stretching back through centuries. Sometimes when he climbed the tower stairs, he imagined those earlier craftsmen, their workshops lit by tallow candles, their benches strewn with pieces still warm from the forge. He liked to think they would recognize him, not by name, but by the way he leaned in to listen to a ticking movement, or by the habit of resting a hand lightly on a pendulum to still it for inspection. The tower itself was a world apart from the bustle below. Its stones were cold in winter, warm in summer, and always faintly damp from the mists that drifted in from the river. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of feet, and as one climbed, the air filled with the scent of old wood and metal. Near the top, the great gears and rods of the clock waited in their wooden frame, silent until the clockmaker turned the key to wind the weights. Then, with a gentle clunk, the mechanism would wake, each tooth catching the next, the whole structure coming alive in a slow, graceful sequence. He would watch the pendulum swing, its polished bob catching the light, and feel the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the village would hear the hours ring as they always had. But the work was not only in the tower. Much of it took place in his shop, where he repaired smaller timepieces brought by villagers. Some were simple kitchen clocks with wooden cases and cheerful painted faces, but others were intricate creations, passed down through families. There were watches whose cases were engraved with initials worn almost smooth, and travel clocks with tiny doors that opened to reveal enamel scenes of distant cities. Each one carried its own story, often shared in whispers over the counter. A clock given as a wedding gift, a watch that had crossed oceans in a sailor's pocket, a piece that had once sat on a great-grandparent's mantle, ticking away the hours of a life now gone. The clockmaker listened to these stories as he worked, treating each piece with the care such memories deserved. He would dismantle the movement slowly, laying out each part in neat rows, cleaning them with brushes and cloths, oiling the pivots until they turned with the ease of water slipping over a stone. The ticking that returned after his work was not just mechanical. It was, in its way, a heartbeat restored. There were days when he lost himself entirely in these labors. The outside world might be caught in a storm, the river swelling and churning, the streets slick with rain, but within the workshop there was only the steady tick and the warm glow of the lamp. Time here was elastic, bending around the work rather than the other way around. It was easy to forget the hour until the tower bell called across the rooftops, its sound reaching even through the closed shutters. On such days the clockmaker would pause, smile to himself, and return to his bench, content that somewhere above the great hands on the tower face were turning true. In the evenings, when the village grew quiet and the last of the shops, visitors had gone home, he would sometimes walk the streets, listening to the clocks within the houses he passed. The sounds were faint, barely audible through thick walls, but he could sense them, hundreds of tiny mechanisms, each marking the passing of time in its own voice. Some ticked briskly, others lazily, but together they wove an unseen fabric of order over the village, a rhythm that linked each household to the next. He thought often about the strange intimacy of timekeeping. A clock was, after all, a silent companion to those who lived with it, present in moments of joy and sorrow alike. It did not hurry the hours along, nor slow them in times of grief, but it kept watch, unblinking, until the day it fell silent. His task was to make sure that silence came as late as possible. In this he felt a kinship not only with other clockmakers, but with anyone who tended to things meant to endure. They, cobbler who stitched strong saws, the mason who repaired old walls, the bookbinder who kept pages safe from crumbling, all were guardians of continuity, ensuring that the work of the past could still serve the present. Once, on a cold morning when frost edged the windows, a young apprentice arrived at his door. The boy had heard the clockmaker was looking for help, though in truth the old man had never spoken of it. Something in the lad's curiosity and careful way of handling a broken watch convinced him to take the risk. In the months that followed, the workshop gained a new rhythm. 2 sets of hands at the bench, 2 heads bent over the same movement, 2 voices discussing the best way to clean a jeweled pivot or adjust a hairspring. The boy learned quickly, and the clockmaker found himself passing on knowledge he had not realized was second nature. He spoke of how to read the wear on a gear, how to feel the strength in a mainspring, how to recognize the unique sound of a clock running well. There were moments of frustration, as there always are in such work, but there was also laughter and a shared satisfaction in hearing a repaired clock strike the hour for the first time in years. Seasons turned. Snow fell and melted leaves. Bushed and browned, and the tower bell kept marking the hours, unchanged. The apprentice grew taller, more confident. until he could wind the tower clock himself without guidance. And always in the quiet of the shop, the work continued. The soft rasp of a file, the gentle click of a case closing, the endless turning of small, bright gears. In time, the clockmaker knew the apprentice would take over the work entirely. The thought did not sadden him. Rather, it was a comfort to imagine that the tower's hands would keep turning long after his own had stilled. For now, though, he was content to keep tending to the clocks, one tick at a time, as he had always done in this little corner of the world where time moved slowly and each hour was cherished simply for being. The sea is never truly still. Even in the softest of nights, when the moonlight seems to smooth the world into silver, there is always movement, a slow breathing in and out, the water shifting and sighing against the stones, as though the ocean itself is thinking in dreams. Far from the crowded ports and the noisy fishing docks, there are lonely stretches of coast where the land gives way to sheer cliffs, and at the very edge of these cliffs, men and women have kept watch for centuries. They are the lantern keepers, the watchers of the horizon, the guardians of the beam that sweeps over black water, telling sailors, "I am here, and you are safe." The work is older than many towns. Before there were lighthouses with glass lenses and coiled staircases, there were fires on hilltops, piled high with pitch-soaked wood, lit at dusk, and tended all through the dark. In ancient Greece, signal fires glowed along the rocky headlands, each one a small defiance against the vast, dark sea. In Rome, great towers were built, their flames mirrored in polished metal to throw the light farther. And long before that, in unnamed ages, villagers would carry their oil lamps to the highest ridge and stand silently as ships passed like shadows below, guiding them not by order or payment, but by the old instinct to keep others from being lost. On a small, wind-lashed island off the coast of Brittany, a keeper named Eloise once tended a tower that had no door at the base. To reach it, he had to climb a rope ladder thrown down from a hatch above, then pull the ladder up behind him so that the wild goats and wandering sheep would not find their way inside. The walls were thick as the length of his arm, made to endure centuries of storms. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of salt and lamp oil. Each evening, Eloise would light the great lens at the top, an enormous crystal structure that turned slowly on its mechanism, sending a beam of white fire out. Over the waves, the light turned, making its silent circle, while far below the waves smashed themselves into foam on the black teeth of the rocks. Alone for weeks at a time, Eloise learned the moods of the sea, the way other men learn the moods of their friends. He could tell when a storm was building by the thickness of the air, when a wind would change by the sudden silence of the gulls. In the deepest hours of the night, when the wind howled through the tower's narrow windows, he would sit in the lantern room, reading old sea logs left by keepers long gone, their pages filled with small observations. 3 ships passed. In the fog, light turned at 9:01, oil nearly gone, wind from the northwest cold. There are lighthouses that stand so far from shore they seem like dreams themselves, barely real in daylight. One such place lies off the coast of Cornwall, where the Wolf Rock Lighthouse rises from a single pillar of granite in the middle of a restless sea. No soil, no grass, only stone and the ceaseless movement of water. Keepers here had to be brought in by boat, timing their leap to the ladder with the rise of the swell. Once inside, there was no escape until the relief boat came, and sometimes that was days late if the sea grew angry. One winter, the keepers were trapped for nearly a month, living on hard biscuits and condensed milk, taking turns keeping the light burning while waves broke so high they struck the lantern room windows. They wrote in their log about dreams they'd had, dreams of walking on land, of hearing the sound of leaves instead of water. The beam still turned every night, even when they were sick with exhaustion, because the thought of a ship smashing itself to pieces in the dark was worse than the cold, worse than the hunger dot in another century. Across the world, a Japanese lighthouse stood watch over the treacherous shores of Hokkaido. Its keeper, a quiet man named Shunpei, had been a fisherman before losing 2 brothers in a sudden squall. He came to the lighthouse not for wages, but for a kind of penance, believing that if he could keep the light burning, he might repay a debt to the sea that had taken more than it gave. Winters here were long and deep, the snow blowing sideways, the wind so fierce it could strip paint from the tower's seaward wall in a single season. Shunpei would light his small stove with driftwood and sit beside it, mending nets not for fishing but for the village children to use in their summer games. He kept a shelf of shells from beaches he had visited before he came to the lighthouse, each one labeled in neat handwriting. He rarely spoke to visitors, but when the relief boat arrived every few months, he would bow and hand over a logbook filled with careful notes. The time of sunset each day, the number of birds seen migrating, the shapes of clouds at dusk. His handwriting was precise, almost like the marks of a calligrapher, as though the sea deserved respect even in the way it was recorded. Every keeper knows the sound of the light's mechanism, whether it is the slow turn of gears in an old Fresnel lens or the steady hiss of a kerosene burner. It becomes part of the rhythm of their days and nights. Some hear it as a comfort, others as a reminder of the endlessness of the task. There is no true rest, only the space between lightings. Many lighthouses required the keeper to climb hundreds of narrow steps several times a night to wind the weights that turned the lens. Each climb done in near darkness, except for the small flame of a hand lantern. These steps wore grooves into the stone so deep that in some towers they remain, even though automation has long replaced the human watch. There are stories, too, of lights that never failed in decades of storms. Off the coast of Maine, the Matinicus Rock Lighthouse was kept for 20 years by Abby Burgess, who began tending it as a teenager when her father, the official keeper, was away at sea. One winter, a fierce nor'easter trapped her, her mother, and her younger sisters inside for weeks, cutting them off from supplies. The waves washed over the island, flooding their house, forcing them to move into the tower itself. Abby kept the lamps lit through the entire ordeal, carrying oil through wind and water, never missing the lighting. Sailors later swore that. They saw the beam through blinding snow and knew they were saved. The sea forgets no one, and yet it remembers no one either. Keepers come and go, their names fading into the stone ledgers of maritime history. But the work remains, a quiet pact between land and water. In the early morning, before the sun has fully risen, the lighthouse stands in silhouette, the last glimmer of the lantern fading in the growing light. The keeper, whether an ancient Greek watchman, a Cornish mariner, a Japanese fisherman, or an American girl, descends the stairs, feeling the stone cool beneath their hand, and steps out into the salt wind. Another night done, another beam set into the dark, another invisible thread woven between the shore and the sea. Even now, when most lighthouses have been automated, their beams timed by precise machines, the stories of the keepers linger like the echo of a bell across the water. Some towers are museums, others left to the gulls, others still quietly working without fanfare. On certain nights, if you stand far enough from shore and watch the slow pulse of a distant light, you might feel for just a moment that someone is still there, tending it, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for a ship they will never see, keeping a promise made long before they were born. When the last of the clockmaker's lamplight faded and the gentle ticking dissolved into memory, there came the smell of salt, faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. The sound shifted too, from the muffled heartbeat of gears to the endless sigh of the ocean, a breath drawn in and released over and over again for centuries. It was as if the very walls of the story had grown damp with mist, the air heavy with the scent of brine, and in the distance far off yet constant, there was the slow turning of a great beam of light. Not hurried, not urgent, but steady. Each sweep carved a pale arc against the night, touching the edges of the black horizon before gliding away again, leaving the dark to settle in like a sleeping blanket until the next reach of light returned. Here, on this lonely edge where sea meets stone, the lantern keepers have always lived, their days and nights woven into the rhythm of waves and the great breathing eye of the lighthouse. In ancient times, before glass lenses and metal towers, there were only fires, stacks of pine logs or barrels of pitch, burning atop cliffs to guide ships that hugged the coast. The keepers then were little more than watchmen of flame, standing through the night with cloaks pulled tight, feeding the fire when the wind tried to take it. The sea was wilder then, untamed by charts or steel hulls, and a light could mean the difference between safe harbor and the tearing of a wooden keel on hidden rocks. Those men and women knew the weight of such a task, though no one came to thank them. They worked in shadow, often unseen by those they saved. The sea would throw storms without warning, rain that struck like pebbles, winds that howled through the bones. the keepers would lean into the gale, shielding the blaze with their own bodies if need be, until dawn loosened the grip of the night and the fire burned low. Then came the era of stone towers, squat at first, built where land jutted into the sea. Each step upward inside was worn smooth by boots, each wall thick enough to laugh at storms. The lanterns were simple, at first oil-fed flames magnified by polished brass reflectors, but they burned brighter than the cliff-top pyres. A keeper's duty changed only in its precision. No longer merely feeding a fire, now there was the trimming of wicks, that careful polishing of glass, the winding of weights that turned the lens. The work was repetitive, yes, but each task had to be done at the exact right time, for a mist step could mean darkness on the water. Darkness on the water could mean death. A life in a lighthouse was not measured in days and months, but in the endless sequence of light and dark, of beams swept and beams returned. Many keepers learned to tell the hour, not by a clock, but by the feel of the machinery beneath their hands. They grew attuned to the faint stutter in the rotation that meant the oil was running low, to the subtle change in the flame's color that meant soot was gathering on the chimney. A good keeper noticed these things before they became problems. The great lanterns themselves were works of art, massive Fresnel lenses that could bend light in ways no human eye could on its own. They were like floating glass cathedrals, each prism catching the flame and multiplying it until it could reach far beyond the horizon. Inside they made a sound, a faint ringing when the wind struck them just right, as if the ocean itself were playing a note. The keeper's life was one of isolation. Weeks could pass without another soul stepping through the heavy iron door. Supplies came by boat or, in rough weather, not at all. Some keepers kept gardens where the thin soil would allow it, coaxing carrots and onions from the earth. Others fished when the sea was calm enough to lower a line. But the heart of their world was the tower, and they knew every stone, every creak of its spiral stairs. The nights were the longest. In calm weather, the keeper would climb to the lantern, room, light the lamp, check the lens, and then sit for hours in the slow rotation of the light. They read books, wrote letters, or simply listened to the sea. In storms there was no time for such stillness. Waves could slam against the tower so hard the whole structure shuddered, and the wind might drive water up to the lantern room windows. The flame had to be watched constantly, for the wind could push smoke into the chimney and choke it, or the glass could fog from sudden temperature changes. There are stories of keepers in such storms wrapping ropes around their waists to anchor themselves to the wall so they could keep working while the wind roared, as if trying to tear the tower apart. In the quiet hours, a keeper's thoughts would drift. The mind in such solitude takes on the rhythm of its surroundings. Time feels slower, like the tide, each thought ebbing and flowing in its own season. Many keepers spoke of hearing voices in the wind, not in the way of madness, but as if the sea itself spoke to them. Old ones told the young to listen, for the sea had long memory. Some swore they could hear the creak of ships long sunk, the laughter of crews long gone. In such a life, seasons mattered little. The sea in winter was much like the sea in summer cold, vast, indifferent. Yet there were changes. Winter brought longer nights and harsher gales. Summer carried more ships across the water, and the distant shouts of crews calling to one another. The stars were the one true calendar, and keepers learned their positions as sailors did, tracing their slow drift across the black dome of sky. The hardest part was often the waiting for the next supply boat, waiting for the next change of shift if there was another keeper to relieve you, waiting for the storm to pass, for the sun to rise, for the moment the beam you tended all night would finally give way to the first pale light of morning. The end of a keeper's watch was rarely dramatic. They did not expect applause. They simply extinguished the lamp, trimmed the wick for the next lighting, and descended the steps to sleep in a small bed tucked in the warmest corner of the tower. And yet, every so often, a ship's captain would send word ashore, a brief note of thanks for the light that guided them in. Those letters were treasured. Some keepers kept them in drawers for decades, reading them on long winter nights to remind themselves that the beam they tended in solitude had indeed reached human eyes. Over time, the world changed. Electricity replaced oil, and the great lamps no longer needed a keeper's hand to keep them burning. Some towers were automated entirely, their doors locked and their steps gathering dust. The last keepers, those who had given their lives to the slow sweep of light over dark water, found themselves leaving the towers for the last time, their boots echoing in the emptiness. But the sea does not forget. The towers still stand, their beams still turn, and in their glass hearts is the memory of every keeper who ever sat through the long night to keep them alive. If you listen in the hum of the machinery and the whistle of the wind past the lens, you can still hear the steady breath of those who once lived by the light. And perhaps when you stand by such a shore, the beam sweeping past you, the salt on your lips, you will understand what it is to keep a light for strangers you will never meet, to live in the space between darkness and dawn. And in that understanding, perhaps you will find a quiet comfort, the same comfort the keepers knew, that in a vast and restless world, even the smallest light, tended well, can change the course of a life. Under the pale light of an early dawn, when the air carried the quiet scent of salt and the sea was still half asleep, the last library before the sea stood as it had for centuries, its weathered stones warmed by countless mornings and chilled by countless nights. It was a building that seemed almost too fragile for the world, leaning slightly toward the shore as though listening to the whisper of the tides, and yet it had endured storms that had splintered ships and winds that had stripped roofs from houses. Its arched windows were clouded with salt from years of sea spray, its heavy oak door bowed and softened by the damp. Inside, the air was cool, smelling of dust, parchment, and the faint metallic tang of the ocean. The shelves, tall as the walls, sagged gently under the weight of forgotten words. Books of every size and shade crowded the space. Thick volumes bound in leather, thin notebooks tied with ribbon, scrolls wrapped in faded cloth. No one could quite remember who had built the library or why it had been placed here so close to the water that, on nights of high tide and restless winds, the waves seemed to climb the very steps leading to the entrance. Some said it had been founded by sailors who, having seen the wide expanse of the world, wanted to gather every story they encountered and anchor it here. Others believed it was the work of a single reclusive scholar who had feared the loss of knowledge more than death itself, choosing this lonely edge of the coast as a safe harbor for his books. Whatever the truth, the library had been a constant presence, a fixed point in the slow turning of years, visited by only a handful of people. Each season, the current keeper of the library was a man named Elias, whose hair had gone white long before his face had gathered the deep lines of age. He had taken over from his uncle, who had taken over from his own mother before that. For Elias, tending the library was less a duty and more a quiet rhythm of life. He rose before sunrise, lit the lamps when the morning fog dimmed the room, swept the sand that always seemed to creep in from under the door, and checked the shelves for any signs of damage. He repaired spines with needle and thread, brushed dust from covers with a soft cloth, and oiled the hinges of the great door so they would not groan too loudly when opened. In the afternoons, when the wind shifted and the scent of the ocean deepened, he would sit at a desk by the western window, reading passages aloud to the silence, as though the books themselves might appreciate the sound of their own words after so long. Few visitors came any more. Sometimes a fisherman would wander in on a day when the sea was too rough for sailing, running his calloused hands along the bindings before shrugging and leaving. Sometimes a child from the village inland would appear, sent by a teacher to fetch a certain book, wide-eyed at the sight of so many stories pressed together in one place. But more often Elias was alone, and in that solitude he had learned to hear the subtler sounds of the library, the gentle crackle of old paper adjusting. In the damp, the faint sigh of air moving between the shelves, the occasional thud of a book falling closed of its own accord. It was in these moments that the building seemed less like a structure and more like a living thing, breathing slowly, content to wait. Yet lately, Elias had noticed something different in the sound of the waves outside. They seemed a little closer, their crash against the rocks a little sharper. The storms of recent winters had been more violent than he remembered, the tides creeping higher along the shore. In the village there was talk of erosion, of the sea reclaiming the land grain by grain. A few even suggested moving the library inland, but Elias knew that would never happen. The building was part of the shore, and the shore was part of the building. To separate them would be like pulling a heart from a chest. It might survive for a time, but it would never beat quite the same. On certain nights, when the moon was full and the waves gleamed silver under its light, Elias would climb the narrow stair to the library's roof. From there he could see the beam of the old lighthouse on the far headland, sweeping in slow, steady arcs. He liked to imagine that the keeper of that lighthouse, whom he had never met, sometimes saw the faint glow of the library's lamps. In return, the two of them quietly keeping watch over different kinds of travelers. The lighthouse guarded those on the water, the library those on the shore, whose journeys were made in the mind rather than the body. There was one book in the library Elias often returned to. Though he had read it so many times he could recite whole passages from memory. It was a thick volume bound in dark blue cloth, the title long since faded from the spine. Inside were handwritten accounts of people who had once lived along this coast, fishermen, merchants, sailors, even lighthouse keepers. Some entries were no more than a paragraph, a single memory preserved in ink. Others were pages long, spilling over with detail. There was an entry from 1843, written by a woman who had spent an entire night in the library during a storm, describing the sound of the rain against the windows, and the way the lamps made the bookshelves glow like embers. Another told of a boy who had hidden here to avoid being sent to work on a whaling ship, only to be discovered by the then keeper, who fed him bread and tea before walking him home. Each story was a small weathered stone in the lone wall of the library's history, and Elias guarded them fiercely, knowing they might be the last words those people had ever set to paper. One morning, as winter began to give way to spring, Elias awoke to a sound that was both familiar and strange. The sea, but louder, closer. When he opened the door, he found that the tide had risen higher than he could ever remember seeing. The water was not yet at the steps, but it was only a few paces away. He stood there for a long time, listening to the rhythm of the waves, trying to imagine them pushing past the threshold, curling around the shelves, lifting the books from their places. The thought filled him with both dread and a kind of melancholy acceptance. The sea took what it wanted, and in time it would take this, too. But until that day came, the library would remain open, its door unbarred, its shelves waiting dot in the days that followed. Elias began to write his own account in the blue-bound book. He wrote of the smell of the sea at dawn, of the way the light fell through the high windows in the late afternoon, of the quiet joy he felt when finding a forgotten note pressed between the pages of a book. He wrote of the sound of the waves at night, of the wind that rattled the shutters in winter, of the beam of the distant lighthouse. And though he did not know if anyone would ever read his words, he found comfort in the thought that they might someday join the others. Another small stone in the wall dot when the end finally came. Whether in a year or a century, Elias knew it would not be marked by loudness or violence. The sea would rise slowly, the steps would disappear under the tide, and one day the door would not open because the water would be waiting on the other side. The books would be lifted, carried, scattered along the shore, and perhaps somewhere, far away, a child walking the beach would find a page washed up on the sand, the ink blurred but still legible, and carry it home. In that way the library would go on, not in stone or wood, but in the stories it had kept safe for so long now, set adrift to find new readers